Welcome to Star-Powered Astrology for Changemakers. I'm Leslie Tagorda, your guide, a Hawaii-born Filipino-Jewish astrologer who loves navigating visionaries like you through the spiritual journey of your work so that you can be inspired to lead by your chart and become the luminary leader you were born to be. Before we dive into this Mars retrograde episode, I have a special invite to an absolutely brand new free masterclass called Radiate, Activating the Luminary Leader Within. This new masterclass came forth during my retreat last week, where I actually was able to expand my framework and connect all the dots between astrology, your inner journey, and the outward expression through your leadership and brand. Your special invitation comes at the end of the episode, so be sure to listen all the way to the end. All right, so now let's dive into everything you need to know about this Mars retrograde. I hope that through this episode that you feel really empowered and activated to harness this special energy in your change-making work. There's nothing to be fearful of. Let's dive in. Well, we are here to talk about Mars retrograde. And if Mercury retrograde strikes a little sense of fear in you, maybe Mars retrograde will strike a little bit more fear in you. But of course, we are here to kind of blast those fears out the door, because we know that when a planet is in retrograde, we're actually being asked to reconsider the process of that planet. So today we're going to be talking about our upcoming Mars retrograde that begins on October 30th, and it takes us well into January. We're going to be talking about it and what it means as it goes through Gemini, and what it means for us change makers. How are we going to dismantle different things about Mars and re-energize our calls to action in Gemini? So we are recording during our Mars retrograde masterclass. So we have some participants, live participants here. I'm so excited to share this journey. So I always love to think about astrology in terms of, as the planets are placed in our natal charts, or as they're moving around the sky and the elliptical with our current astrology, I like to hear them asking us questions, meaning, hey, this energy that we're creating is ripe for this, and how are you going to use this energy? So I hear Mars retrograde in Gemini in 2022 asking us, how will you redirect and reassert your energy through your mindset, thoughts, and calls to action? Let me share my worksheet screen for those of us that are on watching the masterclass. And so if we can center that thought, we don't have to be fearful of about Mars retrograde, right? There are lots of people who would be like, well, Mars retrograde, we have to watch out for all of the shadows of Mars retrograde, the fights and the wars and kind of those shadow things, and the fears and the anxiety and the rushing and the impatience that comes with Mars. Yes, those things can certainly come. But when we start to observe them and say, oh, this is what needs to be healed, this is a shadow version of what's coming up for us in Mars retrograde, that we get to reconsider. So again, we want to ground in this question over the next few weeks. Well, more than a few weeks, 6 weeks. How will you redirect and reassert your energy through your mindset, thoughts, and calls to action? So Mars retrograde, right? It's going to stop at Gemini of 25 degrees on October 30th, 6:25 p.m. Pacific, 9:25 p.m. Eastern. And it's going to hit reverse, and it's going to go backwards in the sky all the way till January 13th. And Mars, I look at the planets as all having a planetary process. Here we go. Mars has a planetary process of showing us our physical energy, that physical vitality that we have. It shows us our motivations and our drives. And when we can't get those, when we can't move forward on those motivations and drives, it can show us those shadows. It can show us those frustrations. When frustrations fester, they turn into anxiety. When anxiety festers, they turn into fear. And so all of that whole spectrum of energy, all the way from fear to excitement and initiation, is all Mars. And so we're always looking in our planetary processes of where we are on that spectrum of Mars. In your change making work, if you are a leader or a healer or an entrepreneur, you're harnessing that Mars to take initiative and to show up as a leader, to stand up for what is right through your advocacy, and to really use that vitality and energy as motivation that keeps you going, even though sometimes all you want to do is put your head in the sand, right? It takes that Mars initiative to keep us going. And so when Mars is moving direct, Mars is showing us all of those different things. And in Gemini, Mars in Gemini, Gemini is a fast acting energy, right? Mars is at home in Aries. And when it's in fast acting Gemini, an air sign, we have all of a sudden fire and air, where things can really whip out and be scattered and be erratic. But this is also where then we get to choose how to harness that Gemini energy. Instead of being scattered and erratic, we can look at Gemini at its highest form of getting clear on our messaging, getting clear on our mindsets, getting really focused on what is this information that we get to share, to cross-pollinate and to socialize. Remember, Gemini as an air sign is a social energy, and Gemini loves to share information. That's why Gemini is classically one of like the teacher archetypes, sometimes that trickster archetype, because Gemini likes to have fun. And so when Mars is in Gemini, and Mars has been in Gemini for a few weeks now, we're having a lot of motivation to spark ideas, to spark our mindset, to really take action on maybe putting together new messaging or putting together new master classes so that you can share the information that is already within you. Now, during a retrograde cycle, Mars will be moving. It has been moving forward. So it's going to make that first pass as it's going forward from Gemini of 8 degrees all the way to Gemini of 25 degrees. So if we look at the schedule here, all the way back in September 4th, Mars crossed that Gemini of 8 degrees. And the reason why I'm bringing up these kind of degrees is because later on, if you have your natal chart in front of you, I want you to look at this place where Mars is going to be crossing 3 times. So back on September 4th, Mars crossed that Gemini 8 degrees, that's that shadow zone. And from September 4th all the way to October 30th, Mars has been moving forward in that shadow zone. Then on October 30th, Mars jumps on the brakes, steps on the brakes, slams on the brakes. Well, the planets don't really slam on the brakes that much. I would say maybe Mercury slams a little bit because Mercury is moving fast. Mars is just is not going terribly fast. So he's not exactly slamming on the brakes when he goes on retrograde. But right at that 25 degree of Gemini, Mars will be stopping right around October 29th and the 30th. It's going to hit reverse. It's going to still be on that Gemini of 25 degrees right on Halloween on October 31st. And then it's going to trace his step backwards, making that second pass from that 8 degree to that 25 degree mark. On Gemini, on Mars's way back, right on December 7th, we're going to have a midpoint. So when a planet is at its midpoint of its retrograde cycle, Mars, this time Mars, is actually the closest to the planet Earth. than it is at any other time of the cycle. So not only is Mars super close, really amplifying all of those energies of Mars here on planet Earth, it feels like an overload. Like if you've heard me talk about Mercury retrogrades, we know that at that midpoint combust, when the sun and Mars meet up, the sun and Mercury meet up in the sky, it's like a full moon illumination for Mercury and the sun. Well, exactly like Mars. During a Mars retrograde, because Mars lives outside the orbit of Earth, the combust is actually, you can see it, Mars and the sun are living on opposite ends of the sky, with the sun is going to be in Sagittarius and Gemini, and Mars is going to be in Gemini. And so this is on December 7th, a full moon phase of Mars and the sun. This is going to be a day where there's going to be a lot of energy, maybe emotions fly really high, especially since the moon will be conjunct Mars. And when I say emotions, like just really notice your emotions when Mars is involved, because again, that spectrum of the emotions that Mars brings through, sometimes it's anger and fear and anxiety. And instead of just like looking at fear and like fearing fear, we get to get curious. Well, what does this emotion want us to learn? Generally, with fear and anger and frustration, there has been some kind of boundary that has been crossed. And so that's why when we're thinking about this Mars retrograde, we're really thinking about our rights. Because when we stand up for our rights or our rights are taken away, there's a boundary that has been crossed. So I want you all to start to notice that when anger starts to flare up, what boundaries have been crossed and what boundaries do you need to readjust and put up there. So that's on December 7th that we'll have that full moon midpoint, the combust of this Mars retrograde, where Mars is going to be super close to us on Earth and Mars is going to be conjunct the moon, really amping up the emotions on that day. So circle your calendar for December 7th, just put a big question mark, and maybe, take a self-care that day, go get a massage or, just kind of like empty out your calendar so you can just be with your feelings. Then we're going to fast forward all the way to December 12th, when Mars will hit back at that Gemini 8 degrees. That retrograde of Mars will be done. And then Mars will trace back through that portion of the sky a third time to catch up going forward and not leaving that Gemini of 25 degrees until March 15th of 2023. And so the last time we had this Mars retrograde, we had it at the tail end of 2020 in Mars's home sign of Aries. And if you can remember back to December 2020, at least for me, when I remember back to those times of December of 2020, like fear was running at an all-time high. Right? We were like now, how many months? Like 9 months into the pandemic. We didn't yet have our vaccines. I remember that I had to take an emergency trip to Hawaii and I was begging my mom to not have to go because I didn't want to be stuck on an airplane with these viruses where we didn't have any of our vaccines. And then when Mars finally left Aries, we had that January 6th insurrection. It's like, you can really see the symbolism of Mars in the sky. But because Mars isn't going to be in his home of Aries, this Mars retrograde is going to be a little bit different in Gemini. So again, Mars is our energy to initiate and take action on our wants and our desires. And Mars teaches us how to be direct. It teaches us how to turn anger into boundaries. It teaches us how to turn frustration into action. Again, anger is an important tool, but when we are going in Mars retrograde in Gemini, we are going to transmute any frustration and anger into words of action. calls to action, right? If you are a business owner or anybody who is a community organizer, you know the power of a good call to action. A good call to action gets your message across. It sparks an emotion. It sparks an action. It lets people know exactly what to do. And in Gemini, that Gemini principle is also about mindset on our thoughts, right? In order to get really clear on our messaging, we have to know what we want to say. And in order to be brave and courageous enough to say what we want to say, that expression that Gemini helps us with, we have to be really grounded in our principles. We have to know that things are right. We have to know that we are worthy to stand by our own principles. We have to feel worthy that our message is correct. And so in this Mars retrograde in Gemini, it almost feels kind of like a Mercury retrograde because Gemini is, Mercury rules Gemini. So we have both this Mars energy as well as this Mercury energy. So during this Mars retrograde, excuse me, we are going to re-energize, reaffirm, reassess, redirect our principles, what we are here to stand up for, our mindset, so we can get really, really, really clear on all of our stories and the things that maybe hold us back from speaking up. And then we're going to get clear on our messages, our calls to action, so that our messages inspire and spark action in others through our change making work. Now, as Mars goes through Gemini, and we'll be talking about personalizations and how to really harness this energy in your own change making work through your natal chart. But as Mars backtracks and highlights through this one area of Gemini, it's going to interact with a couple of other planets at this time. Okay, so of course, we are looking at the general theme of what messages and mindsets need to be re-energized during this Mars retrograde. That's the general theme. And at that midpoint where I asked you to mark that on your calendar at December 7th, what emotions will run high? What can you no longer stand for and no longer not use your voice, right? What emotions are driving you to speak up? That's on December 7th. And then Mars will be squaring off with Neptune in Pisces. We've already had the first square off on October 12th, and then Mars will be then dancing with Neptune again on November 19th, and then again on March 23rd, because Mars is going, whoop, 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 it's doing 3 highlights. So as it squares off with Neptune, it'll come into an exact square off with Neptune those 3 times. I love Mars Neptune aspects because Mars is that physical vitality and Neptune is such a devotional, artistic energy, right? If you natally have a Mars Neptune alignment in your chart by, conjunction, square, opposition, trine, it doesn't matter. If Mars and Neptune are an aspect, likely you move your body in some kind of devotion. I always see this from like yoga teachers or martial arts people, even like really like athletic people who see their sport as kind of a spiritual outlet, or even dancers who see their art form as a spiritual aspect. And so even if you don't have this Mars Neptune aspect in your natal chart, we all get a dose of this Mars Neptune square off with this Mars retrograde. And when we have this, it's what ideas and our action, our vision, will you devote yourself to? Right? This devotion and this action comes from motivating and initiating over and over and over again on this Mars Neptune vision. Okay. Now, Mars will also be dancing with Saturn. So Mars will be trining Saturn also 3 times. Saturn is in Aquarius, an air sign, and Mars is in Gemini, another air sign. And so these are really supportive opportunities. With Saturn involved, Saturn wants us to master. It wants us to be responsible and it wants us to commit. Mars first trine Saturn back at the end of September. Then it's going to trine Saturn again right around Thanksgiving. And then at the very tail end of March of 2023, Mars will trine Saturn again. And so as Mars and Saturn are trining, that's really giving us the commitment to our actions. So we have Neptune squaring off saying, hey, there are going to be events in our lives that are going to ask us to vote, devote, and vote. We are coming into election season. So vote and devote ourselves to our ideas and our actions. And then Saturn is going to support us and really give us the opportunities that allow us to commit and master our actions. Like, doesn't that just feel so wonderful? And then Mercury, the ruler of Gemini, will oppose Mars towards the very end on November 29th. So maybe you'll still be off of, if you're in the States, you'll still be having right after your Thanksgiving celebrations with your family. Maybe there's going to be something or someone that you need to speak up for. So Mercury is definitely, if you're thinking at this point, I'm talking about your calls to action and your message. I feel that as we get to that November, the end of November with Mercury opposite Mars, your message is going to come in crystal clear. Remember, your message doesn't have to be perfect at this time. The way that you perfect your message and you sharpen your message during this Mars retrograde is to devote and commit to it by reiterating it, practicing it, saying it, writing over it until you get it to just where you like it. And then one more player in this, we are going to have Venus in Sagittarius opposite Mars also the day after on November 30th. And so Venus is our attraction energy. So she's going to show you the values and your appreciation of the people and the resources that you want to energize that are going to help you with all of your Mars retrograde themes. I feel that this Mars retrograde is super supportive. It doesn't feel so combative and fearful like it does a few years ago. And so we can really choose to really spark our calls to action in our change-making work. So I want to share 6 things to do and not do this Mars retrograde, because I know that there's often a lot of fear that comes up, especially with a retrograde personal planet. And I want to remind us all that when we really truly understand the weather and the atmosphere and the cosmic energy of this Mars retrograde, we can choose to work with this energy instead of against it. And that's going to really dissipate all of these fears. So number one thing to do this Mars retrograde in Gemini is to manage your fear, anger, and frustrations. If you are someone that tends to get angry a lot or be afraid to take the next step or gets really frustrated by when things don't go their way, this is a time to really work on your mindset. Right? And when we're working on these mindsets, it's not that we want to avoid or bypass these fears, these angers, these frustration. We want to assess them. Like, are these fears valid? Where do these fears come from? What do these fears want us to know? If we have a lot of anger, what boundaries are constantly being crossed? And what can we say and do to stand up for our boundaries? And if frustrations come up, right? What can you control? What can't you control? What can you delegate, release, or just recalibrate? So there's so many things in that aspect that you get to do during this Mars retrograde around managing your fear, anger, and frustration through your mindset. Number 2, during this Mars retrograde in Gemini, I want you to use your words to advocate instead of reject. We forget what a powerful advocate Mars can be. Mars is that energy that tells us to stand up for what's right. And Mars in Gemini has us re-energize our words, the pen as sword, to advocate during this time. Reaffirm your mindset to know that your voice matters. Again, use that Saturn and that Neptune to devote and master your messages so that you can really find your call to action. Because your call to action, you call in your people, you share your vision, you share your values. So much to do when you can find your voice and call in your people through your calls to action. So use your words to advocate instead of reject. And this Mars retrograde is going to allow you to reassess and re-energize your words. I love that because I know I'm personally working on some re-messaging for this kind of new direction of the star-powered brand. So this feels really amazing. Okay, number 3, reassess your motivations and your priorities. Right? Half the time, I know I listen to some of my clients and they give themselves so much guilt for not doing the things that they should be doing, right? That they've been procrastinating or they feel like they're so behind. And I always ask them the question, well, is this what you want to be doing? And oftentimes the answer is no. Well, of course we're not motivated to be doing the things that we don't want to be doing. And so if you are a change maker and you have the ability to create your own tasks and your own goals, make sure that you're reassessing your motivations and your priorities to be doing the things that you love, that give you energy, that put yourself first, not because you're selfish, because when you do the things for yourself first, you're actually building energy in yourself so then you can take care of others later, right? And then notice during this Mars retrograde if your priorities have shifted, because you know what? They shift. And it's okay. It's okay if your commitments change. It's okay if your priorities shift. You can change your mind, especially during this Mars retrograde. Do you desire what you are working towards? Do you still desire what you're working towards? Okay, now the big question, I know that Sarah asked earlier, can I launch during a Mars retrograde? And so I know that there are some wonderful astrologers who really advise us to not launch anything new during a Mars retrograde. And, there are some valid reasons to not release new things into the world with Mars retrograde. But if we understand the themes and the energies of Mars retrograde to advocate, to rethink our mindset, to re-energize and reassess our priorities, like those are just some of those top things that Mars retrograde wants us to do. If you are releasing into the world projects or projects or offers or anything around those energies, yes, this is the perfect time to release them. So again, you can release new messages that re-energize your calls to action. You can, you'll definitely need to put in some consistent, devoted, committed, that's that Neptune Saturn, consistent effort for the long term to make it last. And I would recommend to not launch long-term projects unless you're focusing on Mars retrograde themes. And maybe I'll have to eat my words and we can reassess in the next year, but I'm launching a big long-term project during Mars retrograde. And what do you think, Jeff? I think it's going to go well because we're really harnessing this Mars retrograde about how do we reaffirm our mindset and our messages. Those are some really big things that we'll be launching during Mars retrograde. And so I feel confident. And now, if you are a lucky holder and have Mars retrograde natally, right? You are one of 9% of people that have Mars retrograde, because Mars is only retrograde in its orbit 9% of the time. So 9% of all people born on this planet Earth are lucky holders of Mars in retrograde. You already do things your own way. You're already motivated by things that are kind of against the grain. And so launching during Mars retrograde is really coming back to home. So this could be really, really good for those who have Mars retrograde natally to launch, because you're coming back home. Okay, that's 4 things. The 5th thing, do use your anger and assertiveness in productive ways. Constructive, not destructive. Turn your frustrations into fuel that keeps you going. Turn your anger into boundaries, and turn your powerful calls to action into advocacy. Right? Such a wonderful way to re-energize your Mars retrograde. Lastly, number 6, do step into your own power. With Mars and that Aries initiative, your power is showing up as a leader. Remember that leadership is different for everyone, that there are infinite ways to show up as a leader. So during this Mars retrograde, reconnect, reaffirm, reestablish that connection with your own power. Reactivate your own leadership style if you've been, hiding a little bit. I know I've been hiding a little bit. So this feels really like that amp up, that fuel that I need to reactivate my leadership. And part of that is doing the clearing mindset for me that I'll be doing over the next few weeks, that is going to really clear the space and help me re-energize and re-motivate. So of these 6, managing your fear, using your words to advocate, reassess your motivations, launch using the themes of Mars retrograde, using your anger in productive ways, and stepping into your own power, what most calls to you? So what you've been waiting for, how to personalize this Mars retrograde in your natal chart. Okay. Now, we've been talking about Gemini, we've been talking about Mars, but wherever Mars, whatever house or houses that Mars is tracing through in your chart is where Mars is energizing, adding some fuel to the fire. And as Dana mentioned earlier, it really feels like everything is moving much too slowly, because there's the foot is on the gas. Okay, so number 1 is you definitely want to take a look by house where Mars is going through your chart. Now, likely, if you're not using a whole sign house calculation, you're likely going to have a couple of houses that are being activated by this Mars retrograde. And so that means that Mars is going to be going over one of your cusps, the cusps meaning the dividers between the houses. And so more than likely, if Mars is going between 2 houses, I want you to prioritize the house where Mars is crossing the cusp. Okay, so I know for Dana, you mentioned that your midheaven is Gemini, and at Gemini, I think was 9 degrees of Gemini. Let me just double check. Yep, 9 degrees of Gemini. And so for sure, most of that Mars retrograde is happening for you in the 10th house. And as it's sparking an angle, so if you have a Gemini rising, a Gemini descendant, a Gemini midheaven, or a Gemini imam kule, well, guess what? Mars is basically amping up the energy, and I'm going to say turning up the fire, not to burn it down, but maybe there's parts of things that we do want to burn down so that we can purify and rebuild. But it's going to feel like the entire structure of your being is being lit on fire. And so especially for those of us who are Gemini rising and Gemini midheaven, because these are the 2 most visible outward facing parts of our chart, our rising sign for those Gemini risings who have this Mars retrograde, your leadership is really like it's being sparked. And for you, Dana, with your midheaven being sparked like that, I feel like your ultimate mission and you're getting really clear on what you are here to do in the world. Would you say that that's true for you? Crossing your fingers. Maybe there's still some mindset work to do around there. She says, absolutely. And so when we're looking at the houses, right, we can think about all of like where that's where Gemini is in your chart. And so you know that wherever Gemini is in your chart is where you're supposed to share more information, where you're supposed to cross-pollinate, where you're supposed to teach in your life and your work. And so really thinking about those houses. So I'm just going to go through some of those change making house personalizations. But before I go into that, so looking by house, seeing if you have any angles in Gemini. Again, the angles are the rising, descendant, midheaven, and the IC. And also looking if you have any natal planets in Gemini, right? Dana, I think you mentioned you have your natal Gemini, a natal Mars in Gemini. So you'll be having a Mars return. So coming back to that place of like what really motivates you. I have some thoughts and we'll share that in your one-on-one reading about that Mars at that midheaven. It's definitely like a very physical and very active. I know that there was a research project, and I wish I could remember the astrologers that did this research project, but it was like one of like the earliest astrology research projects where they looked at different athletes and looked at the placements of Mars because that Mars is that physical vitality of athletes. And they found that like, I think it was like 90% of athletes had Mars in the 10th house. It was like a crazy amount of people. So, you know, you are a beholder of Mars in the 10th house and delivering on something that's like very like physically aimed and physically focused. Might be something there, something that's like very moving in your body. So if you have any natal energies, any planets that are in Gemini, do know that as Mars touches a planet, it can feel like an inflammation, right? And so it can like literally show up as inflammation in the body, like an infection or inflammation in the body. But if we're harnessing that fire energy, it can really amp up and just give us that oomph to get things done. And now if we're not used to going so fast, sometimes this can feel like impatience and like, whoa, Nelly. Right. And so just like with my son who has so much energy, like even when he's brushing his teeth, I'm making him like tap his foot or do other dances so that he can like move that body, that energy out of his body, and so he can focus on one thing. So if you're somebody who doesn't do well with like moving like a lot of energy through, like really figure out a way to move that energy through your body so that energy doesn't get stuck and doesn't feel like anxiety in your body. Okay, so for anyone who has a lot of Gemini placements, know that the processes of any of your Gemini natal planets will get a boost of sparked fire as Mars crosses through not once, not twice, but 3 times. So for most of us, we've already had that first pass because Mars has been moving forward and kind of foreshadowing the things that we are here to re-energize and reassert and reassess and reaffirm in our lives and our work. Okay. Now, if you have planets in other mutable signs, so Sagittarius opposite or Pisces and Virgo, expect those natal energies to also feel the amp up of Mars. It's not going to feel so pronounced. The fire is not going to feel so hot as your Gemini energies, but your Virgo energies and your Pisces energies and those Sagittarius energies will also get kind of like a pump of fuel while this Mars retrograde goes through. And I know, Dana, you have your of course your Virgo rising. You also have your Saturn. So, and you also have your Neptune. So committing, devoting, mastering. This is your invitation, Dana. And moving your body to work any fear or anxiety through, right, is going to be the best antidote. So let's look at Mars going through the houses. Again, you want to look at where Mars, where Gemini of 8 degrees through 25 degrees, where that shows up in your chart, because that's going to show us where in your life and your work that you want to reaffirm and re-energize, and also remove like any energy drains, right? Like we're talking about energy here. And so sometimes we're also like taking away energy drains. So stop your energy leaks, redirect your mindset, reassert your thoughts, and re-energize your message. If you're a Gemini rising like me, this is your leadership and your brand identity. Very interesting how that works out. Jeff is nodding because we're going through that right now. If you're a Taurus rising, or you have this energy going mostly through your second house, you're re-energizing your values, your contributions, and just really taking care of your money matters, seeing where there might be money leaks, or where you can reaffirm and reallocate your money. If you're an Aries rising, or Mars is going through your third house, you're redirecting your communications, your calls to action, and your shared knowledge. Yeah. If you're a Pisces rising, or have Gemini or Mars going mostly through your fourth house, you're really putting your energy and your focus in your home base. Maybe this is your family life. Maybe you're going through an office remodel, or your most private community obligations. That's for you, Pisces rising. If you're an Aquarius rising, or Mars will be mostly going through your fifth house, you are re-energizing and sparking your creativity and your passion in your work. If you're Capricorn rising, or have mostly in the sixth house where Mars will be transiting, we're working on re-energizing and looking at energy leaks in your day-to-day sustainability and your operational systems. Oh yes, Capricorn, put it in the good hard work there. If you're Sagittarius rising, this is mostly, Gemini is mostly going through your seventh house, and this is definitely client focused. So reassessing and reaffirming your one-on-one collaborative co-creations and your partnerships. If you're Scorpio rising, which is also ruled by Mars, I forgot to mention that. So, the Scorpios and the Aries, y'all be feeling this as well. So if you're Scorpio rising, Mars will be mostly moving through your eighth house, forming an inconjunct. I don't often talk about inconjuncts, but you really want to notice, especially in your energy, where, and I use this word in the most respectful way, where you're really in debt to your to these Scorpio Gemini energies, healing or talking about it. And so Scorpios don't always want to talk about it, right? They are often biting their tongues. And so as Gemini in the eighth house, your ability to evolve and leverage your liabilities really depends on you talking about it, expressing your needs, sharing your knowledge. Okay. If you are a Libra rising, or have Mars will be mostly going through your ninth house, you are redirecting and reaffirming your capacity to inspire purpose and revision your beliefs. For those Virgo risings, like Dana, with her 10th house being activated, this is definitely about visibility, delivering on your ultimate mission, and recognizing or recognizing your expertise, right? When we're thinking about like that cognitive, that thoughtfulness, rethinking your expertise, seeing yourself as an expert. Dana, you are an expert. You are. Leo, for those Leo risings, or if Mars will be going through your 11th house, you are here to re-energize your larger community for social impact. Get out those, collect your people in your platform, get your social values, really work on those calls to action around the vision of the future that you have, that social impact. If you're a Cancer rising, or Mars will be going mostly through your 12th house, like Sarah. This is mostly about energy leaks, right? Where do we keep on self-sabotaging, right? And how can we re-energize so that we can uncomplicate, simplify, and release everything that just no longer serves us, which is sometimes hard to do, so we can get more into that state of flow, reactivating that state of flow. Does that feel true to you, Sarah, as you feel this? Yeah. Somewhat. Beautiful. Well, I think we've covered everything that I have planned for this Mars retrograde. So before we sign off for today's Mars retrograde masterclass and podcast, if you really enjoyed this Mars retrograde masterclass and would like to take home a worksheet that has some reflection questions as well as how to personalize this Mars retrograde in your chart, head on over to starpowered.com/Mars RX to get your free download. I hope you feel really empowered about harnessing the Mars retrograde over the next 6 weeks. I'm super excited to re-engage and re-energize and reactivate everything about my work. As a result, I'm actually on a podcast roll after taking such a long pause. And so the next episode will be dropped this Sunday on October 30th, the day that Mars goes retrograde. In this next episode, I want to share a little bit about the behind the scenes on this next evolution of Star Powered and how this came to be, and how I'm so excited to share this journey with you, because I know that this is going to help you integrate all of that inner feelings and inner confidence so that you can shine brightly in your change-making leadership. So stay tuned for Sunday's drop, where I share with you all of these beautiful connections. And lastly, remember, this is your invite for my next brand new free masterclass, Radiate, Activating the Luminary Leader Within. In this masterclass, I'm going to share with you the 5 principles about why our spiritual and inner journey is just as important as how you show up in the world, and how your astrology is the key that connects the inner journey to your outward leadership. Head on over to starpowered.com/radiate to join my next new free masterclass on Monday, November 14th, Radiate, Activating the Luminary Leader Within. Chat with you on Sunday. As a human design projector, my energy shines more brightly because of people like you who share my work. If you enjoy this podcast and want to help build a movement of innovative astrology and leadership and spark the intuitive revolution, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, or better yet, share this podcast with your change-making besties. We will all shine brighter together as we create the future we want to see.